So yeah, welcome guys. So that's the second meetup that we have. The first one was in Incremental in Glasgow. This one I've decided to be online because we have two online speakers, so it was kind of easier. So very quickly, just if we have new people in here. So my name is Ronique, and I'm a SharePoint and Office 365 consultant for a Microsoft partner in Edinburgh. And I've created this group because I actually couldn't find any in Scotland, or any that I could actually attend myself, even online. And I'm also a co-organizer with the Scottish PowerShell and DevOps user group, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So what is this group about? Well, it's about SharePoint, online and server as well, Office 365 and PowerShell, but PowerShell only for SharePoint and Office 365, Microsoft Flow and Power Apps. I didn't put Teams in here because this is part of Office 365, but we have Teams as well, obviously. For the categories, so I'd like to do different things, so development, administration for admins. I'd like to talk about security because I think it's important. And I didn't want to forget about the users, so power users and end users as well. It doesn't have to be always technical. It can be best practices or processes or whatever. And if we can have real-world examples, then even better. So if you're looking for some other groups, if you're interested, at least in Glasgow, those are the ones that I know about. So like I said earlier, the Scottish PowerShell and DevOps user group. The next one will be on the 27th of February this month. So, I mean, if you're interested in anything that's PowerShell related, PowerShell core, DevOps, I mean, that's the right group. I know some people in this school are member of this group as well, so it's a really good group. If you're interested in SQL, we have the Glasgow SQL user group, everything related to SQL, data, Power BI, probably some SQL in Azure as well. And it's tomorrow, and it's probably going to be in Incremental, I believe. So if you want to go. And the last one I know about is the Glasgow Azure user group. So they meet every 2 months, and the next one will be on the 20th of February. So that's basically all I have for the introduction. Do you wanna take it away, Eric? You can unmute yourself.
Okay, how's that?
Yeah, yeah, that's better. So okay. Yeah, I'm just gonna make you a presenter.
Okay.
And yeah, and switch presenter. Yes.
Good deal. Then I do have a really short PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is just a quick kind of an intro to the patterns and practices PowerShell library, repository, code, etc. And a little bit about me. I work for Catapult Systems, and currently I've been, for the last 4 years, working with an intranet as a service offering we have called Fuse. And a lot of what I'm doing all day, every day is PowerShell for Office 365, for SharePoint Online, manipulating sites, and so on. I've contributed to the Patterns and Practices library a bit. It does fill a lot of the gaps already, so there's not been, based on my job and what I do day to day, there's not been a whole lot of need for me to contribute. But as I've done my day-to-day work, if I come up with something that does fill a gap, I've done my best to go out and contribute it back to the PNP code base, the repository there, and make that kind of stuff available for others. So I'll kind of walk you through some of that. If you want to connect, you can find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, and that's my handle there, Skaggs. Then we have, this is directly from the PNP team, a lot of these short URLs for things that they offer. So there are videos on YouTube, a lot of stuff on MSDN. There's a large community. I mean, if you guys have been active in the SharePoint community for any length of time, you've probably noticed that it's quite large, quite involved, lots of people. You typically get really good support from folks, and a lot of folks kind of do things in their free time. So it's kind of nice to be involved in the community and part of that community. And as you mentioned a moment ago, Veronique, you know, I'm kind of in the same boat as you, where I'm trying to get we have an Arizona SharePoint user group here in Phoenix, and it kind of faded away a little bit in 2018. I'm trying to revive that for 2019. So our first meeting is going to be the first Wednesday in March. Planning on having that online. If anyone's interested, let me know. I can send you the details on that. But you can find us on Meetup as well. That's the Arizona SharePoint Pros user group. But a lot of good resources out here for the PNP. And PNP, again, is patterns and practices. And it kind of takes us to the next really colorful slide. There's a nice shortcut URL there for it. But essentially, I'd like to kind of touch on why PNP. You know, I have PowerShell with SharePoint Online. The SharePoint Online management shell is what Microsoft provides to run PowerShell scripts against SharePoint Online. And that's true. I'm going to show and illustrate that PNP fills a lot of gaps. And you'll see that. The PNP group has a lot more involved to it than just PowerShell. But again, I've been doing so much with PowerShell, I wanted to focus on that. Tons of people are contributors, lots of MVPs, experts, people who should be MVPs and aren't yet, and so on. Just folks who are, you know, making a living doing this kind of stuff and contributing back. It really makes your life a lot easier. And I included a couple of my contributions there. The add PNP publishing image rendition commandlet, and then recently the reset PNP file version commandlet. So if you've got any familiarity with the classic experiences in SharePoint and publishing features, image renditions have been a prevalent capability of SharePoint for a long time, and it just basically resizes the image based on what rendition you decide to use. But in order to add image renditions in the past, you had to do some funky stuff with adding files to the appropriate place in the SharePoint environment, and it wasn't hard. It was just not as intuitively easy as you would like it to be. So I created the PNP Publishing image rendition commandlet to make it easier to add image renditions. And then recently, like I said, the second one there, the reset PNP file version, will go through and take a specified file and set it back to its previous version. And so these are, you know, parameterized commandlets and are integrated with the PNP library. So if you pull down the latest version of PNP PowerShell, these things will be available to you, if not today, very soon. I know the image rendition one is, and the file version, I think, is about to be. I don't know that it is officially, but you know, we can certainly look into that as well. And so, as far as the PowerPoint here, I want to give you an idea of what you can do with the PNP PowerShell that you cannot do with the SharePoint Online Management Shell. And so, when working with PowerShell, you can actually quite easily get all of the commandlets available to you within a specific module. And what I've done here is I've extracted the commandlets available to you from the SharePoint Online Management Shell. So this is the native, ability that's provided by Microsoft. And if we just count the number that's down here, we have about 155 commandlets available to us. And you'll notice they typically have a standard prefix, SPO for most everything. And in the world of PowerShell, you've got the verb here, and there are certain approved verbs that Microsoft will always use. So these are 155 commandlets that you can utilize and leverage for SharePoint Online directly from Microsoft. If I pull up the same list from the P&P library, we have 381. So quite a few more of these P&P commandlets. And then again, just kind of focusing on the prefix on these, we have P&P instead of SPO. And that's a good visual indicator as to which library you're actually using, if you're using Microsoft versus the P&P group. Okay. And I'll just keep an eye on chat after for questions. If anybody does have questions, feel free to put those out there. But what I want to do is we can jump into kind of a quick demo here. I have a couple of sample scripts. They don't do too many complicated things, but I wanted to kind of illustrate the point here is when you're working with, this is the SharePoint Online Management Shell provided by Microsoft. And what this is doing is it's connecting to a particular site and getting some of its properties, just listing those out here for me. So with the Microsoft SharePoint Online Management Shell, in order to connect to SharePoint Online, I have this connect SPO service commandlet. And that is always going to connect to the admin site. So whatever your tenant name is, mine in this case is Eric James Skaggs. You add the -admin to that, and that's your tenant admin URL. So we're going to connect to the tenant. And then we're going to get all the site collections, and then we're going to get one particular site collection, and then just select the properties of that site collection. Okay, so let's try to run this. And of course, logging in is always fun, so bear with me. Okay, so we connected to the site, we connected to the tenant, we listed out all the site collections, and then we grabbed one of the site collections and output the properties of that one site collection. So I've got a few sites out here, and here are the properties of that one. Okay, so what's important to kind of collect from this example is you first connect to the tenant, then you have to go find the site collection you want, and then do something to it. This other sample is somewhat similar, but you'll notice kind of the key difference here, if I could just comment these out, is we're going to connect directly to the site collection that we want right off the bat. And we're using the connect P&P online commandlet. So P&P is obviously to call the patterns and practices, and we're going to connect directly to that site right off the bat. Save ourselves a few lines of code, a couple lines of code, which over time does make quite a difference. So I guess I would probably want these listed here. Similar scenario, run that, and I do have a credential stored here on my local machine in the credential manager. So in this case, I didn't actually get prompted to log in. It's got my credentials stored on my machine securely, and it went ahead and just logged in and went out and grabbed the site and output just the basic information about it. So that's one of the key differences I like to point out is by using P&P, you can connect directly to a particular site collection, and that can save you some time instead of always having to connect to the tenant and then go find the site that you want and work through it there. And then we can get really interestingly complicated. Let me pull up the actual, if you go to github.com/SharePoint, this is kind of where all the SharePoint documentation and code lives. And there is a repository out here called PnP PowerShell. And let's go into that. And there's a lot of information out here. You can look through the source code, of course. You can contribute to it. But if you scroll down, it kind of says, here's what you can do to install it. How do I install the commandlets from PnP? And then there are the 3 different modules. PnP PowerShell Online, 2016, 2013, and I imagine soon we'll have a 2019 version as well. So you can install them, bring them down, they'll be installed on your machine, and then you can start leveraging those. Another thing to consider, and this is something that I've been doing for a few years now that I do prefer, is I actually don't install these at all on my machine. I've kind of created my own module, which makes it easier for me to redistribute things to other developers as well. But I have a module here. Let me clear this up a little bit and kind of focus on what we want to talk about. I've created a module that imports references to the PnP modules based on the SharePoint environment to which I want to connect. And inside this module are all the assembly references to the PnP libraries, Microsoft's libraries, along with the client-side SDKs for the different versions of SharePoint. So essentially with this one module, I've kind of put a wrapper around how to install PnP, and you can simply connect to an environment by passing in the parameter. And so you would connect either to SharePoint Online, SharePoint 2013, or SharePoint 2016, and you don't actually have to install any of the SharePoint PowerShell anything from Microsoft or PnP or otherwise. It will load it dynamically for you based on the environment to which you're connecting, which is pretty handy because I essentially, using this kind of an approach, we can write one script one way that ideally works in all environments. There are always stipulations to that and exceptions to the rule, but that's kind of the idea, is to have a script and be able to connect to any environment. And the way that works, again, is you've seen that here. I didn't really point it out earlier, but on line 3, I'm importing the module, and on line 4, I'm calling the module to connect to SharePoint Online. So if I wanted to connect to SharePoint 2013, I would literally just change that value, or 2016, and so on. And then it allows me to do some really fun things and automate some tasks. And what's interesting, too, is that these commandlets, you recall the prefix on these is PnP, whereas the ones for SharePoint Online are SP&O. The SP&O commandlets typically only work for SharePoint Online. There are some exceptions to that, but the PnP commands typically work for SharePoint Online and SharePoint On-Prem. So there's a lot of benefit to using PnP. You've got cross-platform compatibility along with many, many more capabilities. And with that, one of the other items here I like to show is something as simple as creating site collections. I have a, day-to-day I'm a developer. I'm automating things in SharePoint Online with PowerShell, but also helping leading dev teams create solutions that run there. So a lot of what we do is manage developer sites. So this is a script that will connect to the tenant, and it goes through and deletes site collections. This is using the Microsoft SharePoint Online Management Shell. And then we've got a script to create site collections, which does use PnP. So there's been some new stuff that's coming out with the modern experiences, different types of sites. And I've got this set up pretty nicely to read from a CSV file and create multiple site collections and multiple threads very quickly, and saves a lot of time. And then there's a third script here, turn publishing features on if we're working the classic experience and want to turn publishing on, which takes a lot of time as it is. But the process for us right now essentially is we've got a nice little CSV file where our folks can fill it out and enter in the values that they want for the different, the title, what type of site is it using a particular site design. So, as we're working with site design in the modern experience, we can do blank, showcase, or topic, or if you have your own and you wanted to add those, you could do that, along with the URLs and whoever might own the site. So it's a nice, quick, and easy way to rapidly create multiple site collections at once. And there are P&P commandlets that facilitate that. So this is creating a classic site, and it's parameterized with a title, URL, owner, and so on. And you can do that with the SharePoint Online Management Shell, but it's not as simple as one line of code necessarily. There might be some tricks some hoops you have to jump through. So the P&P commandlets essentially make the code cleaner, shorter, easier to read, process, run, and understand, which is very helpful. So I'll pause there. Does anybody have any questions?
But I can have one question. How often do you mix both of them in the same script? Like, do you use the SP&O and the P&P at the same time, or there's no need for that?
That's a great question. The short answer is my own personal philosophy on it is I only use SP&O when I have to, because most everything is covered by P&P. And also, if I find something is not covered by P&P, it kind of encourages me to go contribute to the P&P repository. So, I mentioned the example of setting a file back to its previous version. You can do that with the client-side object model code, and put it in there as the 50 lines of code or whatever it is that you need to do. But I found it useful for my day-to-day work to actually spend the time to contribute that to the P&P repository. And so now, instead of the 50 lines of client-side object model code in a script, I just have the one line of code that resets a file to its previous version. But the short answer is there are some things you must do with SP&O. Like if you're going to connect to the tenant level, that admin site, and do something like manipulate multiple site collections at once or what have you, you're probably going to be working with the SP&O, which is the SharePoint Online Management Shell. But outside of that, if I can do it with P&P, I will usually prefer to do it with P&P.
I think you can actually connect. I used a script where it was connecting to the tenant, right? The P&P Online, right? And then I was looping through each site collection that I had because I wanted to retrieve the site policies, right? And I could do it with P&P. I actually don't remember the last time I used the SP&O commandlets, to be honest. So that's why I'm asking, how often you actually use those SP&O commandlets, because I don't use them very often anymore.
Yeah, and I agree. It's over time it's become less and less. In fact, right here, I am connecting to the tenant site with P&P Online and not SP&O or not SP Online. So this is, essentially doing the same thing. But there are some nuances to SP&O, so I'll do it with P&P. But if I have trouble or it's not working for some reason, then that's when I'll have to switch back to SP&O. But again, most of the time P&P has you covered because there are so many commandlets that just aren't available in the SharePoint Online Management Shell. Another thing that I found to be particularly frustrating is, and this is why I don't install anything, like I don't install the SharePoint Online Management Shell, and I don't install the P&P commandlets. I load them dynamically at runtime using that module I showed you, which, if we dive into that a little bit more, this will basically take in the environment parameter, right? And then there's a switch that just says, hey, if it's 2013, import the P&P 2013. Or if it's 2016, import the P&P 2016. I found that if you have, if you install the P&P commandlets and you're using a newer script or an older script, you can typically have some frustration because the script you found to do the task you want is using an older version or a newer version than what you actually have loaded on your machine. So there can be some frustration there. But the other item is when you've got different versions installed, they can conflict with each other and cause confusion as well. Again, because the actual names of the commandlets for each one are the same. Like new P&P site in online is still new P&P site in 2013. So you know, it's good to only really load what you want, what you're using, and this is a good way to do it. It's nothing fancy, and definitely happy to share this too if anyone's interested, or a version of it anyway. But give me an idea too. I've got a few minutes left, it looks like, and keep me honest on time and let me know when I need to stop. But one of the things that you may be interested in is contributing to, honestly, either the SharePoint environment, like this is all open source SharePoint code, and there's a ton of stuff out here. You don't have to contribute to PowerShell if you're not familiar with PowerShell. The other day, just in this documentation repository, there were some just typos, some misspellings. And so I pulled it down and fixed it. I literally pulled a page into Microsoft Word and ran spell check and corrected things one by one, spent an hour reviewing it and kind of proofreading it, and then I contributed it back to the repository. I believe it was approved. Let's see. But little things like that are a great way to contribute, and they're then available to everybody. So it's not just you. You're contributing content for everyone. Let me see if I can find this here. SP Dev Docs, contributors. The people who contribute the most are always at the top. So Vessa's a big one. Bert's a big one. Let's see, Waldeck. All sorts of folks are out here. And I might be out here somewhere, maybe not. Maybe you can't find me right now. Maybe the list is just too long. But essentially that's what we did, is pull in a file, spell check it, fix it, contribute it. Really simple, really easy to do. Since we're talking about PowerShell, one of the interesting things about the PowerShell repository is you can think of the PowerShell is a wrapper around client-side object model code. And you know, that's really all it is. So there are two solutions that are involved in contributing to PowerShell. There's the P&P Sites core, which is the CSOM code, and then the PowerShell repo is the PowerShell wrapper around the CSOM code. So you've got to contribute to the P&P Sites core before you can contribute to the PowerShell repository. And they've got a lot of instructions and documentation on how to contribute and what's involved and how to set things up in GitHub so you can pull it and contribute it and branch it and do everything you need to do. But let's see. If we go to extensions, file folder extensions, there's me, but somewhere in here is going to be our reset. Here it is. So here's our function. Let me zoom in a little bit. Reset file to previous version async, and there's just a lot of client-side object model code here, but there's a lot of documentation as well, so that the documentation is automatically generated from the source code in most cases. So sometimes in order to update documentation, you've actually got to recompile the code, but not in all cases. But there's a function here to basically reset the file to the previous version, which does the client-side object model work. And it's all designed the way it needs to be. If it's running on premises versus if it's running in SharePoint Online, you'll see the tasks and the async calls and the awaits and so on. But that's the complicated part. Once you've got it down to where the client-side object model code is running, the next step would then be to go into the PowerShell repository. And if I can find this offhand here, files, reset file version, and this is the easier part because it's pretty well documented and pretty consistently structured. And this is just decorating a class. It's a reset file version class that inherits from the PNP base. And we're saying it's going to be reset-PNP file version. And we've got some parameters. And it's just an extension method on the current web object that says call the client-side object model code passing in the parameters. So it's pretty lightweight and not overly complicated or scary on this side. So contributing to the PowerShell repository may seem daunting at first, but definitely well worth it if you can. It gets your name out there and helps others at some point. If you're finding a gap in the PowerShell, I'm sure you're not the only one being affected by that, and so if you have an opportunity to contribute, that's definitely encouraged. And if you're just bored one day, you can always come out to any of these repositories too, and click on issues up here at the top, and start taking a look at some of these issues. And there are some issues that are, no one's looked into yet, and you may have an opportunity to work on it, fix it, and contribute it. By all means, you could certainly do that. There's a lot of stuff out here for sure. Any other questions?
Guys, if you have any questions, just unmute yourself. Don't be shy. Okay, so if there's no questions, then I have some. I'm going to be selfish now. So I was talking to Erwin a while back because I was saying that it's great that this module is using the credential manager, and so it's very annoying for other modules when you have to enter your credentials again, because when you have long generated password, random passwords, then it's not nice. So we mentioned the get PNP stored credential command. So I was trying to look for it, but I don't know really how to use it. So I mentioned that any other command that actually support the PS credential object, then can use this commandlet, and so you can retrieve it. So do you know how it works?
Offhand, no, I haven't used that one. It was PNP stored credential?
Yes. And you get the
come
add as well, I believe, and remove, something like that. So I would assume that this is actually, you know, pulling the credentials from your credential manager. Let's say if you're using the SP&O module, which actually doesn't support the credential manager. So, I mean, that's my understanding, but I can be wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I've not used that one myself. There actually is, from the home page of the PowerShell repo out here in GitHub, there's a link that takes you to a kind of a more attractive, easier to read, digest page of the commandlets that are out here. PNP stored. So there's the get. Okay, so this add, we'll add it to the Windows Credential Manager. So it looks like get will get it from the Windows Credential Manager.
Yeah, if you're using another module that doesn't support, you know, the Credential Manager, but I'm not sure how to use this command with another module, or how to know in the other module how to use this one. Let's say you take the SP&O commandlets, right? And you want to use this get credentials, store credentials. I'm not sure how to actually use it. That's why.
So let's see. I'm going to pull this up on my side here. See what kind of trouble I get myself into. Give me 1 second. So you can only see. Can you see one screen or two screens?
Well, one screen. Now we just see your ISE.
Okay. So I don't know. Here, let's see if this works. I just say Eric James Skaggs.sharepoint.com, and I run that. Okay, so that gave it to me. So I'd probably say credentials. Probably store that in a variable. And then if I try to use that, so it has a username and password property. So from here, I would probably try to connect PNP online to some site.
No, you would do the connect SP&O then. And for the credentials, you would use the credential variable. The SP&O service.
Okay.
Or SP&O online.
And
then when you put your admin center URL or something.
This one here.
Yeah.
Something along these lines, right?
Maybe.
Oh. Credential. Cannot find it. So it's not being converted to the appropriate type. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, we might at that point need to create a actual SharePoint credential object, because you've got your credential.username, and so there should also be an encrypted password as part of that, I believe. Somewhere in here, I've got an example of that. Something like this. So credentials, let's call this creds. And this will be SP creds. I didn't like that.
But that's okay. It's just, you know, I just wanted to know if you knew about it. That's all. But
yeah, not offhand. I've not had to use that myself. One thing I've looked at doing though, we are at Catapult. We are automating some activity in SharePoint Online tenants using Azure and a credential asset in an automation account. And so there are ways you can securely store credentials in Azure similar to this. And then at the beginning of your script, you would go get the credential asset from Azure, create your SharePoint credential object, and then use that to connect. And that might be a more flexible alternative for long-term use, given that it won't be you won't be dependent upon the current machine you're working on.
Do you know if it's a cross-platform yet?
To what degree? What do you mean?
On a Mac or Linux machine, can I use the PNP module?
For that, you're going to want to look at the Office 365 CLI, which is the command line interface, which is cross-platform, and I don't know if it does. I don't think it does everything, but it can do quite a bit. CLI. Oh yeah, it's in its own repository as well. But this is kind of the Linux Mac approach for the same thing. And of course, the syntax is different and unique, and I don't know much of the details behind the scenes for it, but
okay.
This is one of the things that they do talk about this pretty frequently on the calls. The PNP team has several calls that they run per month. So if you're interested in attending even more calls, you can pull up one of these URLs and go out and find that. Add it to your calendar. There was actually a call this morning. It was kind of just a monthly update on the status of things with the dev team and the PNP team. They also have a JavaScript special interest group, a SharePoint framework special interest group, and there's been quite a bit of talk in these calls as well about the Office 365 CLI and that kind of stuff. So, like I said, my day-to-day is mostly PowerShell, so I don't get to do a lot of the bleeding-edge, really super cool stuff. But I do make a point to attend these calls because that's where I get the latest and greatest info on, what's happening. The PNP team has grown so quickly and so immensely that it's turned into it used to be a group of folks that were just kind of doing something to make their own lives easier. But now it's officially sponsored by Microsoft and kind of has that Microsoft backing and encouragement, and it's become a real entity. It's a lot of fun to keep up with.
Okay, cool. Last call, guys. Do you have any questions?
No questions.
Okay. In that case, thanks very much, Eric. That was really nice. I mean, I enjoyed this topic myself anyway, so at least it was very nice for me.
Very good. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Okay, so we're just going to wait for Chris, the second speaker. So we're just going to have a break, and as soon as I see him there, I'll ask him if he can start. So yeah, thanks very much. It's noon for you. So I mean, you can. Happy for you to stay, but if you want to leave, it's fine as well. It's just I'll stay for you. So,
sure.
But
yeah,
thanks very much again.
I'll stay. I'd like to see the second half, and also,
cool.
If anyone does have any questions that come up, feel free to post those in the chat, and I'll do my best to reply.
Okay, cool. So let's just make a break, and like I said, as soon as I see him in the chat there, I'll ask him to start. Eric, if you want to stop sharing, you can. There? Yeah, okay.
There we go.
Cool. We don't want to see your passwords.
I appreciate that.
Okay, Chris, do you wanna start?
Okay, yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks, Veronique. Welcome to everyone here tonight. Thanks for taking the time to come down. And my talk today is on Microsoft Teams. It's entitled "Let's Talk About Security." So just before we get to what it's actually about, just to introduce myself, my name is Chris Hoard. I'm a modern workplace consultant here in the UK. This is my first time speaking at a user group event, so I'd like to just thank Veronique for giving me the opportunity to do so and for you to take time out from your evening. I'm an MCSA, Office 365, as well as a Microsoft certified trainer and educator. I work a lot with Microsoft here in the UK and with Corp. I'm a PCSM. If after this kind of talk today you want to kind of follow up, you're very welcome to reach out to me on Twitter or at my website, which is microsoft365pro.co.uk. As well as the certifications, I work a lot on the as a contributor on the tech community, which if any of you are not part of, I would really recommend you to join. There's so much support on there and so many pros. I'm part of the Microsoft 365 Partner Council and also part as Mapper, Practicing Architect as well. I guess I work across the whole range of Microsoft 365, but I have a particular passion for Teams and traditionally Exchange, which is what I was doing 10 years ago. So to start today, we're going to be talking about security and the security of Teams. Teams is a collaboration application and is designed for inner loop communications with the immediate team. And I think from Microsoft's perspective, they are very vocal at the moment about its success. These are the statistics that we saw from Ignite last year. So 329,000 organizations use Teams. That's today. At this point in time, that's risen to over 400,000. And of those organizations, 87 Fortune 500 companies, 54 of those customers have over 10,000 or more active users. So it's been the most successfully or the successful growth of an application in Microsoft's history, and every time and everywhere you go, it seems to be talking about Teams. Teams as the center of the modern workplace. And if we look at what's actually kind of driving that growth of Teams, I think the best way to do so is to break it down into all the elements of the modern workplace. So when we talk about modern workplace in Microsoft terms, we talk about the elements of modern desktop, of teamwork, of intelligent communications, and of security and compliance. From modern desktop, we're looking at Windows 7 and Office 2010 end of support. That conversation tends to go down more towards the Pro Plus and the Windows 10 side of things. If we talk about security and compliance, we naturally gravitate towards GDPR, and so we're going down and talking a lot about Intune and EMS. But if we talk about teamwork or intelligent communications with our customers now, we talk about modern collaboration, and we talk about the transition from Skype for Business, and all of that leads to Teams. Even if we talk about modern desktop or security and compliance, and we talk about Pro Plus and we talk about Intune, again, we can very easily work them into Teams. So Teams has really become a flagship application for modern workplace, or when we have that conversation about Office 365 or Microsoft 365. What's also driving its growth? We've got the changing workplace or modern workplace itself. So we're seeing an influx of millennial workers, which means different expectations which come to working with applications. Those younger workers tend to be less engaged on email and more towards the apps that they've grown up with, more in terms of instant messaging, more in terms of working with different forms of communication other than what we have traditionally. We also see an increasing need for mobility in the workplace, which means less of sitting at your actual desk or in one location. We're constantly on the move all the time, and so we need to be able to have access to those apps on the go in many different forms to how we want to communicate. We see a decreasing need for siloed work. So this again, today I think it's been recognised on the whole, and I know this is a generalisation, and Microsoft give a lot of statistics, but productivity is really governed by teamwork as opposed to this working by yourself on your own. And it's recognised that there are many different kinds of teams that can work across the workplace. You can have departments, you can have virtual teams, you can have interests and hobbies. You can even have it for particular issues. So there's many different ways in which we can work with teams and collaborate both within the organisation and with people outside of it. And it's also a movement away from point solutions. So what that means is that instead of one application to do this and one application to do that, Microsoft 365 and Teams as the flagship application and representative of that is really moving away to a more kind of unified ecosystem, a unified single pane of glass. So again, the narrative is there. We also see what's driving the growth of Teams is the UX, the user experience. We're talking about the single pane of glass. It's about bringing that workspace to the actual user. So not having to go into several different or authenticate onto to all these different applications. It appeals to those millennials in terms of communicating in many different ways, but it saves us time in having to open browsers or have several browser windows open, or have to go and require to get access for something and wait for that to be cleared, and then waiting for an email which comes back after 2 days. Again, it is bringing that workplace experience to the actual user, and giving them far much more flexibility than they had previously. And finally, another one of those drivers that's driving growth is the sheer amount of resources that's available for Microsoft Teams. So for everyone on the call today, I'm sure you may have seen one of these, but over the last kind of 6 months, Microsoft have worked very hard in the adoption resources for Teams. So on the shot here, you have the Adoption Hub, you have the Teams Toolkit that's just been released, and you also have the Teams Knowledge Base. So if you use the Teams desktop client and you go down to the Help section, they're actually building a knowledge base for users right behind that too. So they're trying to, there's a lot of information that's available. If you have something like, Exchange or SharePoint, it might be a little bit harder to get that information. But again, because Teams is front and center, there's a lot of resources that you can consume and support your users in the adoption. And so this is really where we start talking about security, because Teams is this app which is growing phenomenally, because it's being pushed by Microsoft, and because there are several driving factors. We're seeing Teams adoption go up rapidly, and as we're seeing Teams adoption go up rapidly, we're also seeing the need for governance. And when I talk about governance here, we're talking about the ability to manage Teams, the ability to secure Teams, and the ability to implement compliance within Teams. And we're at an interesting point, because Teams has been out for a while now. It's been out just over a few years, and we have organisations that both have a reactive need for governance and a proactive need. So a typical customer that's been using it for some time, 6 to 12 months, they've already got it set up and in use. They have dabbled in it. They've created a few teams. They've created some channels and some tabs and put together some simple applications. We're seeing a lot of these type of organisations. They're eager to adopt Teams. They've bought into the narrative, but they've just switched it on and they've dived in. They've not had the security conversation already, and so they find themselves in that reactive need to go back. And on the other hand, we have some organisations that have used competitive products such as Slack, or just don't use an in-a-loop collaboration application, and they're hesitant to adopt it. I'm certainly seeing organisations that the first conversation is administrators need assurances to be able to control Teams, because deep down they want to protect the org and to protect the users as well. And so security is coming up in both of these cases. And on the right hand side there's just some of the examples of security questions that I tend to have on the first meetings with customers. They ask me, is my team's data safe? Or how can I restrict the creation of teams? Or how can I control teams on their mobile? Or what's the visibility of what's going on? There are several questions, and you yourself might have some of these questions and or are working through with your users or your customers today. So what we're going to do from this point on for the rest of this talk today is talk about the security matters that we should be considering in our team's deployment, or if we've got to a situation whereby we feel like we're a little bit out of control with our deployment of teams and we need to rein that in a little bit and put this security front and center. It's very easy when doing demos of teams to become very wrapped up in it, and the need to collaborate almost trumps the need to have secure collaboration. And if you see a lot of vendors today, particularly ones like AvePoint or Fusion or the like, then they're talking about governance being central. And Microsoft themselves, they were very much, when Teams was first out, don't put restrictions on teams, let users be creative. And a little bit down the line, you're then seeing questions from users and organizations that say, well, hey, look, I'm part of 56 teams. I've got access to maybe resources that I shouldn't have, or I've installed applications where I don't know what the privacy agreement is, and so on and so on. So we're going to start off with the very basics, which is really the security 101s. I mean, these are the kind of talking points before you even do a deployment of teams, or the first thing if somebody comes back and says, I really want to think about how we can secure this, that you can open up the conversation with. So the first is to talk about how Teams is compliant with security standards. I think this is just 101. I mean, if it was me, I wouldn't adopt an application in my organization if it didn't meet this criteria. So Teams is compliant with ISO 27001 and ISO 27018. So that's the Information Security Management System, and a secure control of PII, which kind of goes without saying. Really, any application that you use in your environment should look to be on those standards. And it's also as well part of the cloud, is compliant with the Cloud Security Alliance. Now, they are three of the major ones, so Teams is a big tick in how it's compliant with security standards, but there's lots more. And on the right hand side you can see some of the standards of which it's compliant. Okay, so that includes FedRAMP and HIPAA and SOC 1 and 2. One of the most important ones, I think, is the EU harbour controls as well. Again, particularly if you're in Europe, that matters in the same way that FedRAMP matters if you're an organisation based in the US. Now, where Microsoft takes this compliance very seriously, so I'll just give you one example, and that's FedRAMP. So if you very shortly, or Teams at the moment is being rolled out for government in all of the kind of separate markets, with the first one being US. Because it is not 100% cleared FedRAMP, then your actual external applications in Teams is completely locked and greyed out. You can't even install them as of yet, and it's going to be another few months before that they do that. So they're very conscious about making sure that they're certified from a security perspective before they start opening up or introducing new functionality. And as you can see down the bottom, they go into this pretty deep. And you can go to docs.microsoft.com, just put in Teams and compliance, or Teams security compliance, and you can go to quite an in-depth article about that. Alternatively, if you go to the Security and Compliance Center within your 365 tenant, then it will also show how Teams is compliant there. The second thing is the data that we actually need to secure. Now, it's amazing how many conversations that I have with providers of 365 as much as customers, that if you sit down and ask them, where is the data in Teams actually held? Many of them don't know. And this screenshot, which was taken at ESPC in 2018, is also being kind of rolled out in a lot of the events. So if you're going to London for Ignite the Tour and you go to a Teams session, and if there's any on the architecture, then this will come out. They're trying to make as transparent as possible where you're actually your data in Teams is located. So if it's the chat service, okay, that then it gets ingested into Exchange. If it's files, it's stored in SharePoint and OneDrive. So it's important to understand where all the data actually is, because when it comes to security, you're not just talking about Teams itself. You're also talking in part of other applications such as Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. And the third kind of 101 when it comes to talking about security with Teams is there really should be an assessment that should take place. Is that when you're having a look at security, it's important to have a look at the existing solutions against what Microsoft Teams provides. So we've talked about those security standards. Does the other solutions have those security standards? We've talked about the data. Where is the other solutions' data is held? But it's really important, I think, to have to answer such questions as how do users use Teamwork? What apps are they using? Are their devices currently protected? And what risk this could cost to the business, and is there any security gaps in the use of their other teams? Now, most people talk about this in terms of collaboration. That's how it's traditionally been done. What apps are they using? So, for example, a traditional Teamwork assessment would look at how an organization is using OneDrive for Business and using potentially Dropbox, but they're never compared, or they're compared on a very surface level from a security standpoint. So when you do an assessment, it's important that you take all the things and all the security things in Teams and all the compliance and compare them with the other solutions. So that, or alternatives, because this tends to highlight how good Teams is with security. It's a very underplayed aspect. So we've talked about these kind of security 101s, the things to start out with when having a conversation about security. The next is, as we go into features and functionality, is all about authentication and access. So I think one of the most important things, or one of the easiest wins when talking about security with Teams, is talking about multi-factor authentication. So this is going on beyond that basic username and password to be able to sign in. And of course, multi-factor authentication will not just be about Teams as an application, but it will be about all the applications within Office 365. And multi-factor authentication, as you may know, is all about hardening the front door against attacks. And this protects against such threats such as brute force password attacks or password spray attacks. We're going to be potentially storing very sensitive information in Teams to be able to work with. I think that if you're going to want to use it to its fullest capability, then multi-factor authentication is a must. And with multi-factor authentication, I would also recommend the Authenticator app. Now, when you put on multi-factor authentication, you can choose to have your phone called, or you can have a text come through to your phone with a code. The easiest thing is the Authenticator app. You will click if you can see in the left-hand side, once you log on to Teams, it will then ask you within the mobile app to approve the sign-in. It's much easier to use, but the great thing about the Authenticator app is that the Authenticator app is not just going to protect Office 365. I see it used in organizations, and organizations say to me, look, we're using it for 365, you take a look at it, and that's all it there is protecting. It can also protect your Microsoft MSA accounts too. So that is your Outlook.com, for example. And I think that is really important because from a security perspective, you want to protect against the social engineering attack. You hear of that you'll find, or the attack will come through an actual personal account that's completely unrelated to the Office 365 system, because people are not only deciding to use their work's email, but they're also deciding to use their personal email, and they'll email back and forth between the two. So the attack won't actually come against the actual Office 365. Somebody will go on or get the details or manage to get the credentials off of something like of LinkedIn or Twitter or another social site. They will then attack the actual Microsoft account, start to get access to the details, and then try Office 365 or getting to another person and launching attacks, social engineering attack. So if you're using Teams, okay, you've got multi-factor authentication. You've also got the Authenticator app, which can protect not only Office 365 but all those MSA accounts, and it can protect other things as well, such as websites. So WordPress, that's another great example. And I think if you're going to be taking websites and personal accounts into the whole ecosystem of what users use in an organization, then Authenticator is a very important application indeed. You then have AAD Password Protect. So this is all about banning easy to guess passwords. As you can see from the screenshot, that's just what it looks like actually in Azure. You can set the lockout thresholds, what the duration for the lockout is, and you can ban all those passwords. People are using passwords like pass.123 and hello.101, and you hear about them all the time. You can use Password Protect to protect your access to Teams on top of MFA and Authenticator, and that is going to protect you against password spray attacks. Password spray attacks will go under the limits of being locked out and then target every user in the organization in the hope that one has this kind of low password. That's why you can kind of present. You also, should you want it, do also have a default list from Microsoft too, so you don't have to populate everything on this list, only if you have custom that are kind of almost known within the organization. You then have identity protection itself. So this is all about calculating sign-in and user risk levels. Okay, so what that means is that let's say that you're in a certain geographical location in the south of the UK, and then suddenly 1 hour later you are then logging in from an IP in Ayrshire. That just kind of geographically can't happen. It's also as well about secure or risky accounts, so users that kind of do a lot of travel or in a lot of different environments or their connections over time. So you can, again, there's this another layer of which it will monitor how people log in, and then if they even think that it's a risk, then they will lock out. This is a big one for Teams, I find, is conditional access. Now, with MFA, this is tend to be paired up with MFA, and to be able to use kind of conditional access to its fullest extent is that you need Intune and Azure AD Premium. This is all about controlling where users can actually access Teams and the other applications in Office 365. This very much shrinks the attack vector. And where it's really effective, I think, is where an organization is assessed about who actually needs to access their applications outside of their workplace. Some people, I mean, this is a very kind of talking point. Some people will say that they should have access to anywhere and then lock it down on a device aspect, whilst others will say, well no, these users have no need to be able to access Teams outside. And Teams is a kind of increased because it holds files, because it's to do with chats, because it has all these different applications, and you're working with a lot of data within that application. You do have to ask yourself about whether every user needs to use Teams outside of the organisation. The organisation that I work for is 100 people, and if I was really honest about assessing about how many people either work remotely or need to work remotely, you're probably going to be looking at about 20%, maybe 30% of users. So I would say that conditional access can be very effective for keeping your use of Teams and the other applications within Office 365 to devices or locations or to trusted locations. So Microsoft 365, because it has Office 365 and Intune and Azure AD Premium, if you're using the enterprise version and EMS, gives you the ability and is the perfect solution really to being able to control where you can actually access Teams from, easily controlled from Azure. And recently, Teams actually introduced admin roles. So I think this is the last element of authentication. This is all about specific team roles and what people can actually do within Teams. Now, we've got past the stage where it was basically all or nothing in terms of administration. You're either a user or you're kind of a global administrator. The RBAC, role-based access control, has got a lot more granular, and 4 different team roles were brought out, and you can see these on the screen: Team Service Administrator, Team Communications Support, and Team Communications. And they can all do different things, and you have to ask that, does every administrator in your organisation, do they need to be a global admin? Do they need to have that full access control? Because not many that I know do everything to do with everything. And again, if I go back to my own example, being in a 100 user organisation, how many people truly need to be global admins for their whole 365 and their Teams environment? 1 or 2 or 3 maybe. And I'd also make the recommendation here to not only granulate these roles about what admins can actually do with Teams, but also as well that with the global admin role is to not have any personal users with that global admin role. That's just a general kind of recommendation to throw in here. The reason is because with the global admin role is really the keys to the kingdom, and if for somehow, I mean, it would be a lot more difficult if you applied MFA and Authenticator and these other things that we've talked about in this section. If for somehow they did, then they would have the access to change anything. But if you have only users as users and have the global admin role on a kind of almost a different user that's only accessible within inside the organisation, then again you're going some way to improve the security in your Teams environment and your wider Office 365. So now there's creation, policies and audit that we move on to. The big thing, one of the big things, and this comes up a lot of time on the tech community, is the issue of team sprawl. That means is that users can create their own teams, and in consequence, they tend to multiply like wildfire. So day one you roll out, maybe half a dozen are created, and then a few months down the line you have 75 of them. And the difficulty about this is that becomes very problematic from both a management perspective, but also from a security perspective, because from a security perspective you are kind of exponentially increasing the attack vector. So what's important is and for a lot of organisations, is they kind of realise in the end which one is the kind of worst of 2 problems. Is it restricting groups, or is it kind of all these multiplying groups that are increasing the attack vector? And So this is really recommended a lot, which is that teams are based upon Office 365 groups, and with Office 365 groups, if you restrict Office 365 group creation, then you can stop users being able to create teams. So it prevents that team sprawl. It prevents unknown hidden teams. So if you've ever tried in the Teams client to have a look at all the teams, you may have encountered problems because those teams are seeded from the graph. And so if you go in to have a look at all the teams, sometimes you may not be able to see all of them. That, of course, is arguably an example of shadow IT. So I would recommend, if you're going for a more secure approach with inside your environment, is lock down who can create teams. And even go one further, and that is to use another app within 365 which is Forms, to RFC every time you create a team. You might use another application to be able to do this, or an app internally if you've already got an RFC, but RFC the actual creation of teams, and you would record them because you'll be recording what their original state is. So if you're standardizing teams, now the reason that this is very, very important to kind of record their original state is because the IT administrators, if you lock down teams, and it's the IT administrators that are creating those teams from that point on. When you create the teams, you create them with owners and you create them with members. Owners can modify teams. So essentially you're creating them and then handing them over for maybe another individual within the organization to manage. So it's going to protect administrators to be able to control their creation, but also to RFC, either RFC when a new team is created, or what you do is that you have a standardized template with which to create them, and then they're handed over, and then the liability for that kind of management of the team goes with it to those team owners. Another good thing about the RFC is that you can cross-reference this with the audit log. If you've got the original state of what that team was created, either with a template or with an RFC, you can go and cross-reference that with the audit log and the security and compliance later on. And one of the good things about if you do use Forms, I just thought I'd chuck in here, is that you can actually automate the creation of teams with Flow. So you could, almost create the details of the team through the actual form with the RFC on it, and then by the time you finish and fill that out, bang, Flow then can then go and create the team itself. We're talking about standardization, so as well as being able to control the creation and kind of record the creation, it's also about standardization. Normally when something is standardized, it is arguably more secure when doing so. So if you've seen or have access to the Teams and Skype for Business Admin Center, I would recommend to, if you haven't seen it, get your admin to show you about the Teams policies that can be created. Now on the left-hand side you will see their messaging policies. You also have meetings policies, you have call policies, and you have both what they call default and custom policies. It really is all about the standardization of Teams. You can create Teams templates and almost replica the Teams once you've created them as well. But as you can kind of see here, just from the sliders on the right-hand side, because you can see if you open up that message policy, you can do stuff or prevent things like the deletion of messages. And the good thing is about that is that it feeds into data loss prevention, but also as well preventing not only insider threats, but actually I would say things like threatening messages as well. You have to ask yourself, do you want users being able to delete the messages with inside? I mean, I don't know, for example, whilst that's a slider on and off, probably would be better with PowerShell, but you can see that from these policy templates, this is normally a much better way to be able to secure if you standardize your teams and introduce custom policies when there is a specific need for you to be able to actually have to do so. You then have the audit log search. This is a great one. The audit log search, if you've seen it or used it, this is in the Security and Compliance Center. This records all teams' activities. Microsoft do it today, but it wasn't always so, and that's to ensure that this audit log search is turned on. So I would check your Security and Compliance Center to make sure. And there was a brilliant solution that I saw a while back, and I've done this ever since as well, is that you can generate from the audit log search email, and then when certain types of activities happen, it emails you. Well, what you can actually do is, with a team, you can actually set the audit log to email a channel within that existing team to have an audit history of that team. I thought that was a really brilliant solution, rather than having to almost search through the audit log. You can have rules that pipe the audit log into channels, almost like a feed, so that you can actually audit that team. I thought that was real clever, and that's caught on a lot from members of the tech community, and it's something that we found out afterwards that Microsoft do themselves. So that's a really cool kind of way to see what's going on. If we can see what's going on, it's going to raise our security, because it might bring things to light. It could be things that we don't want going on inside the organization, regarding things like apps. So it's recommended. And then also as well, the content search. So content search is all about querying Microsoft Teams. You can do spot checks, and this is another thing that protects against insider threats. We move on to the next subject in talking about security, which is in external communications. It's pretty self-explanatory, this one. I think pretty early on, it's important to have a conversation about whether your organization with Teams is going to go and allow external access or not. A lot of organizations are, for example, they like to be able to turn external access on, because they want to be able, they would say one of the biggest selling points about Teams is the idea of being able to federate with other organizations in exactly the same way that Skype for Business did. But also as well, since GDPR, since greater compliance regulations, we're actually seeing it kind of even out a little bit, and a lot of organizations are saying we want this to be an organization, we want this to be an application, that is for internal users only. They want to keep those communications. And there is an upside from a security perspective, because if you do block external access, then that's going to augment your DLP policy, and it's also going to protect, quite a lot against, external threats. Guests putting, potentially opening up for guests to be able to put any kind of threat through one of your applications. And that moves us on to talking about guests. So about guest access and what guest access can do. Guests are, there are generally two types of guests in Teams. One are federated, and I guess those are users that work in other organizations that use their tenant and then access your Teams instance. Or you have anonymous guests, so that's just people that don't use Teams or don't use Azure AD, where they have something like a Hotmail or a Gmail account, and they, again, guest access comes into the same conversation as external communications. What are you going to allow those guests to do inside your environment? I mean, you can see here on the screen it says guests can delete sent messages. Now, if that user was somebody completely outside your organization, and all they had was a Hotmail .com address or a Gmail, and they were logging in, and you were putting kind of conversations that were, for important projects, and they can come along and they can delete that without kind of no consequence. You have to ask yourself about whether that's a setting that you actually want on, or what you want guests to do. So again, that's an important element to consider when having that security conversation. It'd be even more important if if Microsoft intends to be able to raise the functionality of guests in terms of being able to have them, use files and upload files. So that's going to be really important in the future. This is going to be a pretty one-on-one conversation. So we talked a few times about DLP. We also have to consider information protection and retention. I'm going to go over these kind of pretty quickly because they're deep subjects, and you could probably talk on each one of them for about an hour each. When having a security conversation, data loss prevention is something that for me is a bit like MFA. It's a no-brainer. So you can apply data loss prevention to chat and channel. You do have to have it on a separate policy in the Security and Compliance Center as opposed to your other DLP policies, which cover Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. The DLP prevents data leakage, insider threats, external threats. It protects a number of things. Now, in the example that you can see here, imagine that you are speaking. This is with guests. These are people outside your organisation, and this is a typical situation where somebody might say, "Oh, can you send me credit card information, or can you send me somebody's personal data?" And the person that's within the organisation is unsure about, and they try to send it. It's not just email that we have to have with DLP or within documents. It's now over IM. And potentially those other third-party applications as well through the use of Teams. So DLP is a one-on-one conversation on security. The same goes for information protection. So this refers, rather than chat, this refers to files in Teams. So files in Teams are housed in SharePoint and OneDrive. And information protection and the rights management service is all about controlling those documents. If they're there in the team site, should every member of the team have access to those? Should guests in the future have access to those? I think it's very important to protect the data as far as possible. If we were using this, in SharePoint, then 9 times out of 10 we would be employing AIP, labeling, and classification and controls within the classic SharePoint experience to be able to control those files. With Teams, the amount of organisations that I've seen that doesn't use information protection, that just throw up their files into the Files tab within Teams. This is a practice that it's harder than DLP to implement because there's a bit of user education involved as well. And with retention, this again, this is talked about a lot in the security documentation. It's the retention of this data. And it's all about the ability to do things like perform discovery and legal hold. It's about data leakage and data litigation, retentions. If you've used Office 365 prior to this call, then I'm pretty sure you've either already applied it or are considering it. Like DLP, like Azure Information Protection, it is really a 101 tool. The stuff that's going into Teams, we should really be looked to keeping for compliance, but also as well in terms of security, we need to protect against those things. And security doesn't always just have to mean kind of threats. Security can also mean protection against different kind of threats, such as financial threats to the actual business itself. So by applying retention, protecting us against litigation is quite important to do. Applications. This is, I guess, for me is one of the most interesting things in terms of security. Controlling apps is probably the biggest talking point that I have. This is because we were talking right at the start about this single pane of glass, the ability to bring the workspace to the users within the organization. And I'm pretty sure that you've seen, if you've ever used Teams, the store that you can enable a whole load of other applications into the team experience. I mean, there must be over 100 now. So you have the default applications that are within Office 365. Those are things like SharePoint and OneDrive, and then you have all the external apps, and they can be anything from GitHub to Adobe to all these other ISV vendor applications. And you have the ability within the main Office 365 control panel to be able to control which of those external apps you want in the store, and on Teams templates for which ones you want them to be able to have access to. And this is really important because these, by doing this, by controlling the applications, it protects you from a whole range of threats. Things like data harvesting, external threats like malware, shadow IT. And one of the kind of deficiencies about Teams at this moment in time is that if you go into the store, it's not very transparent about how secure those third-party applications are. I mean, I'm sure, again, that they have passed security compliance tests, and they are regulated. However, that isn't very transparent. And I will just give you an example of what it is that I mean. So this is something that I took from the actual terms of the Q AI application. There is something called Q, or Module Q, and this is a third-party application that can be installed into Teams. And if you actually read into the use policy, you will read about how much information that it will actually harvest off of you, how it will link all of your details to your social media. It will search for your social media, it will connect your social media sites, it will be building almost to an extent a profile about you. It will connect to your account information and friends and contacts lists. Do we want things like that? Do we want applications doing that actually within our organization? And so one of the security officer's job, along with the enterprise admin within the organization, is really to look at these applications. Microsoft have kind of said on several occasions they're going to make it easier. Do we know where that third-party application data is held? Do we know where the app itself is hosted? Is it hosted in a data center, a tier 3 data center? Do we really know any of these things, or the applications we're installing? I went to an organisation the other day. They were 1,500 user organisation that were just in the proof of concept, as it were, and they'd rolled out 2 team sites without any kind of management whatsoever. They just let users install apps, and they must have installed 24 apps. And when you ask them this simple questions, you said to the user, where is your app data held? Where is your app? Where's the application itself hosted? The user didn't know. Now we probably can't expect all users to know that, or even to be interested from their perspective. They just want to do their job. But as administrators, our job is to protect the users. It isn't Big Brother. You're doing the right thing to ask, is this application right for us? And there is other things that can help you do that, to do that with Teams. If you're using external applications within Teams and you are using, and this is running on your desktop, you can always look to use Cloud App Discovery, or Cloud App Security as it's known, because Cloud App Security will protect against unsanctioned apps. If you're going to go down the route of being more users to more freely add applications, this protects against shadow IT. So, for example, they install a third-party application through Teams, and you didn't know it existed. Let's say they had a new app, and it was just its integration with Teams was just being released, and the user went on and installed that. Cloud App Security would actually see that application being used, and then you could unsanction it and lock it down that way. It protects against high-risk apps. It also monitor suspicious use. Teams can be used with things like bots. Now, if somebody's going to integrate, or clicks on, if you allow them to install these external applications, and they put on bots, and then suddenly somebody is uploading a lot of stuff to bots when you're supposed to be using OneDrive in the organisation, then you know, you've probably got a security risk right there on your hands. So Cloud App Discovery is a recommendation when using Teams if you're using high numbers of external applications, and also Intune as well, because that actually not only controls Teams but controls applications on the devices. And I think that I love Intune. It's like Teams. It's one of my favourite applications within Microsoft 365. It can do so much. But if you can imagine Teams being used not just traditionally on the desktop, but used within the browser and also used in a mobile phone. A lot of organisations today have bring your own device policies. You don't know where they got their phones. They could, to all extents, have gone down the road and bought it from cash converters and don't even know that their phone is jailbroken. And yet they're freely downloading the Teams app. They're installing it on their phone, and then your corporate data is then on a device which is jailbroken, and you know that's just a DLP, GDPR infringement right there waiting to happen. But with Intune, you can enroll a device, you can make sure that it's compliant, you can then designate and push the app out to the device, but you can also apply app protection policies, such as restricting copy, cut and paste, kind of in the same way that you can do with the Outlook. And you can apply that to iOS, you can apply that to Android. You can also do it on Windows 10 devices as well. And with Windows 10, you also have the ability to use App Blocker too. But I think that if you're using Teams, using Intune to be able to control the Teams application itself, kind of a bit like MFA, it is a really good thing to have, you know, and to employ. So supervision. Now this is new to Teams. This is something I think that everyone is going to be wanting to use. So this is only something that's been announced in the last week. Supervision is new to Teams, and it's all about capturing user communications for review. Is to ensure compliance, but also as well it protects against legal exposure and insider threats. So what compliance is about doing searches on keywords within Teams, and then what happens is that you will have that almost fed back to you, and it will be identified. You can create a policy that says if this word flashes up within a conversation within Teams, we as administrators need to know about it. Now this is an extreme kind of example, but you know, if there's somebody within a business that says they like guns, or they say that you know that they're making a bomb, you know, it's the kind of thing that things that used to happen on phones, that when you used to say a word, it used to go and then kind of set a rule that would then have your phone conversation listened to. Now again, this isn't Big Brother stuff. This is just all about being aware of when something like that happens in that type of environment. In exchange, supervision can take place through things like rules. You know, if something goes in an email, it will trigger a rule that goes for the administrator to be able to review. Supervision will do this with Teams. If it happens in a chat instance and a word is mentioned, then it will be flagged to review. I think it is a kind of tools that as administrators that we definitely need to increase the security within our Teams environment. So the final thing is certification and training. Now with certification and training, this is certification and training I think for both administrators and users. The reason why I put kind of training from a security perspective is because I think that the more educated that everyone is within the organisation about how to use Teams, there's a massive difference in terms of the kind of security, how hard the actual security within the organisation is. So if you are administrators, the first place I'd probably start off is that there are 2 Microsoft Teams courses on edX today. You can do them both for free, but if you want the certificate, they're £77. Now the first one is Enabling Teamwork with Microsoft Teams. That goes through all of the kind of parts of Teams. So it shows you, it goes into detail about the chat features, about the applications, about the voice, about the conferencing. It goes into all things like networking, how to administer. And then you have the Microsoft Service Adoption Specialist. So the Adoption Specialist is all about rolling that out within organizations. And I guess this is it covers a little bit about what we're talking today. So we're talking about all these security considerations when actually using Teams within your organization. They are the kind of things that both the administrator and the person the project manager who's rolling out Teams in the organization need to consider, along with the security officer. So they are, as I say, they're free, but they're about £77 each to get a verified certificate. So between the two of them, you can do them for pretty much about £150 at the current time. The second one is, if you're looking at it from, because the other two are Microsoft, even though they're Microsoft certification, if you're looking at it in terms of the traditional MCPs, then the Microsoft have just released Microsoft 365 Teamwork, the MS300. That is the only exam within Microsoft today to feature Teams. It's not a Teams-only exam. It also covers things like SharePoint, and Teams, and OneDrive too. Teams constitutes around about 30% of the exam, but it's currently in beta. So what that means is that when they release an exam for the first time, it goes into a beta period for 3 months. So its general availability, because it was only recently released, will be in April, May time. So with beta exams, you can take them once. And then once you've taken it once, it gets marked a few weeks after it goes into general availability. So it's a combination between those two edX courses, and certified edX courses, and between the MS300, they are everything really that you can get in the current time on Teams. And in terms of end user training, I would say that there is important having end users trained in Teams as far as administrators too. Users need to be aware of threats. They need to be aware of the consequences. I'm not going to lie, 9 times out of 10 it probably involves challenging the existing culture and practices. A few examples are that multi-factor authentication. You know, if you're just traditionally logging in with a username and password, somebody will say, well, why do I have to click an app on my phone? Or take a code on my phone and put it in. This is just all too awkward. I don't want to do this. Another one, if you were implementing supervision, you know, people will say, oh, this is kind of Big Brother type thing. But it's not. You know, you're doing it to protect the users so that the organisation doesn't infringe things like GDPR. They use the kind of corporate data in a more controlled, safe way. I completely understand, you know, like most people, the need to want to facilitate users and for them to collaborate effectively. But there also does have to be a kind of meeting in the middle to know that it's not just about collaborating recklessly and at any cost when putting the organisation at risk. Users need to know that how much an organisation how much of their revenue they're actually fined with should they be in breach. And if they're at the cause of that breach, then, you know, I would like to think that organisations would keep those users on who are at the centre of a GDPR breach. But, you know, trying to be realistic about those things, you know, you can't say that that's going to be the case. So users really need to understand that they have to use things securely. So we've come to the period now to you know, for any questions to be able to ask. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. We've been on quite a tour de force of things, but as you can see, I've literally kind of talked solidly for an hour, and there is a lot to talk about. And if you put all these things into a true assessment, it could be a day for you know, or to be able to sit down and to discuss these things. It could be a workshop, and you can see about how many things that would actually come out the back of this once we actually start thinking about security in a Microsoft Teams context. So does anybody have any questions from today?
Just unmute yourself, guys, if you have any questions.
This is Alan. I'll pop in and ask a question. Thank you very much, Chris. You've mentioned and used the term pane of glass a few times, and allowing folk to be creative, and millennials may adopt an interface with a lot of apps and varying things going on. For the organisations that aren't so keen to adopt that strategy right away, apart from the obvious training and things you've covered, what experience have you had of addressing non-millennials, shall we say, and those who maybe don't want as cluttered an interface?
I think that's a very good question, and I think that how you use Teams, I mean, you're right. It's not just about millennials who come from the kind of the phone and the mini app experience. You have to also think about other users, not from those generation in time. Some organisations, some other people from other generations who see things differently too. I mean, I think sometimes that does come down from in part that can be due to education. In terms of adopting or embracing a new way of doing things, supporting them with actually using it. They sometimes need to see the benefits, and almost like kind of a work. I'm trying to think of the right word for it. Almost like a time and motion study, and see the benefits of how it can actually help them to benefit their role. So you can almost spin up proof of concept teams with those users. Another one I think that admins can do is, we were talking about templates. You can make teams very kind of straightforward. So what I mean by that is that it might just be to start with about instant messaging and presence, or the use of files. It doesn't have to be about all the bells and whistles, external applications. So I had an organisation who were maybe about 500 users, and they had exactly this question. They said, look, users are just going to kind of push back if you kind of have all the bells and whistles on it. Of which case you can just block all. I mean, for those certain types of users, if they're in their teams, you can just start out by blocking all the external apps completely, and then phasing in, and concentrate on instant messaging and presence, then kind of concentrate on applications, then concentrate on audio conferencing, then voice. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, that's actually kind of what I was thinking of. It's more that, I guess if you were to compare it something along the lines of like updating Office even, whereas you've got your main release, your semi-annual targeted, I guess obviously you could have certain groups with varying access and the likes, and that's kind of what I was looking for, is maybe you could go in and give 10% of the organisation the full experience, whereas others would then be the secondary group, the third group, etc. And I just wonder if you have had that experience, if there was anything you could maybe share on the kind of deployment approach. It's just to theorise how an org would get the product in and get Skype out the road, if you get me.
Yeah, that service adoption course, specialist course, will be completely up your road. That's what it's all about. It's all about taking, it uses Teams basically as one giant case study as to how it can be rolled out most effectively within an organisation. And it's all about creating champions within that organisation and advocates. So, I mean, if you could, for example, imagine the most kind of change unfriendly, for want to say, belligerent person, who is sitting there saying, I'm not going to change. And you get them to start using it and get them to be almost like an advocate, and a champion, within your organisation, then that helps immensely in terms of. And the service adoption specialist is all about that, and all about tactics of what you can use to create a change within the organisation, to make all different types of people and personas embrace that change. So whilst out of those 2 edX courses, one is kind of very, very technical in terms of, you know, in all the voice, it goes into all the networking, all the port ranges if you're going to go down the voice route. And the service adoption specialist is all about getting people to embrace that change so that you can roll out teams more effectively. I'd really recommend, yeah, you can do that course for free. Don't have to buy a certificate. You can go on and all of the resources are there for you to access.
That answers my question. Thank you very much for that, Chris.
I'd also want a tech community as well. So if you go to techcommunity.microsoft.com and you go to the community driving adoption, and within that they also have the Champions Corner. That's run by Caruana, who in Microsoft Corp is one of the big teams people. So in both of those communities, so that's driving adoption and the community corner, so they're both in the same community as it were. If you join both of them, then you'll have tons of people in there, you know, change professionals, you know, migrations professionals, MVPs, that will be able to give you really, really solid advice on how to do that change. Even, you know, if you can reference the tech community on you know, right at the start of the project, and as you go through and you've got certain questions as they come up, they're great voices to lean on to.
Any other questions? Nope. Well, in that case, just a couple of things before we finish there. So first of all, I just want to say a big thanks to the speakers. I mean, that was great. That was very complete. So thank you very much, guys. Chris, I forgot to say, because I said it at the beginning, but I'm recording the session. Is that okay with you? So I can share it after?
That's not a problem at all.
Okay, cool. Are you going to be able to share your slides? Would that be okay as well?
I'll send them over for a copy for you, so that, you know, everyone that's here today can receive a copy of them. As I say as well, you know, I'm starting up doing a lot of blog writing, like starting up talking about user groups. So I'll be doing quite a bit of writing on Teams in the future as well. So you can always follow my blog. You can always follow me on Twitter. And also as well, I hope to, you know, to work with Virginie in the future too.
Sure, I'm sure I'm going to call you back. Okay, yeah, you can just send me the a link or the slides, and I will post them in the group then.
That's brilliant.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a good evening.